Hi, St. Mark's. Of course, February is Black History Month, and last week I started a discussion about African American church music and African American music included in the hymnals 1940 and 1982. I plan to do part 2 of this series today and talk specifically about the Lift Every Voice and Sing hymnal. Before I start talking about the Lift Every Voice and Sing hymnals, I'd like to take an opportunity to share a bit of a personal note. I have to admit I struggle a bit with African American church music because it's not one of my specialties. It's not something I've studied, it's not something I've performed a great deal of. I, like many Americans, if not all Americans, find this period in history difficult to deal with. It's really a struggle, and I'd like to shy away from it rather than leaning in and telling the story. But, in fact, shying away is the worst thing we can do. During this Black History Month, in addition to studying African American church music, I've also been watching lots of documentaries and TV series that discuss Black history in America. One of the most intriguing series I've been watching is called Finding Your Roots. It's a PBS series where genealogists and historians track the personal history of an individual, their genealogy. And they also work with scientists who analyze their DNA to validate the story and also to tell another part of the story in many cases. The guests in this series are varied. They come from many different backgrounds. But it's interesting to note that many European Americans can trace their lineage back to the old country, and often several centuries back, whereas African Americans stop at the Civil War. They only get 3 or 4 generations because census records during that time period before the Civil War only showed sex, age, and value. They showed no names. And of course, as slaves, African Americans didn't hold property. They don't have titles or deeds that would tell us who owned the property. So the paper trail really just stops with sex, age, and value. When I was in high school, I was assigned a genealogy project in my American history class. And we were supposed to trace our ancestry as far back as we were able to do. One branch of my family goes back to the Plymouth colony, where one of my ancestors was a minister, a Puritan minister. In doing this genealogical research, I also discovered that both sides of my family, my mother's side and my father's side, owned slaves. And on my mother's side, we also have an ancestor who was a notorious slave trader who imported slaves from Africa and sold them for profit. I readily admit that this 21st century Episcopalian struggles with this part of my family's history. I wish I had a time machine to go back in time and tell them what they're doing is wrong and that I absolutely cannot abide what they've done. I don't have a time machine, but what I do have is a camera, a piano, some research, and lots of stories to share. I can use these tools to tell the stories of these people, tell the stories of my ancestors, as well as to tell the stories of the people they enslaved. I can learn about the music they created and share that with all of you. Before I moved here to Florida, I lived in South Bend, Indiana, and I would often pass by a Reformed Jewish synagogue. And in front of the synagogue, displayed very prominently, was the synagogue's motto. Their motto was to remember the past, to live the present, to trust the future. To remember the past, to live in the present, to trust the future. This motto seems very fitting as I did research for the origin of Lift Every Voice and Sing, and the role that this hymnal plays in the life of Black Episcopalians. In 1981, the Episcopal Commission for Black Ministries worked with the Church Hymnal Corporation to produce Lift Every Voice and Sing, a collection of Afro-American spirituals and other songs. This is also known as Lavis 1. In 1993, this hymnal was revised in consultation with the Standing Commission on Church Music to produce Lift Every Voice and Sing 2, also known as Lavis 2. The introduction to Lavis 2 includes a lot of good historical information about African American music in the Episcopal Church and the creation of these two hymnals. It recounts the history of Black people in the colonial Church of England, and that Black Anglicans began to blend African and African American musical practices with the musical practices of Anglo-American colonists. The introduction includes a quote from the Reverend Professor Robert Bennett of the Episcopal Divinity School, which at that time was associated with Harvard University. In his article, Black Episcopalians, A History from the Colonial Period to the Present Day, he writes, "In the South, where the majority of Black Episcopalians were to be found, and where prior to the Civil War, the Bishop of South Carolina claimed more Black communicants than white, and where Black churchmen worshipped in separate galleries or chapels. It was this body which described their plantation Holy Communion services in the spiritual. Let us break bread together on our knees." It's important to note that many Black Episcopal congregations have had renowned music programs and traditions, including, among many others, St. Thomas in Philadelphia, which was founded by Absalom Jones, featured on the Lent Madness bracket this year, St. Philip's Church in New York, St. James Church in Baltimore, and Calvary Church in Charleston. Many of these churches had concert series in addition to their liturgical music, and these concert series often featured choral music written by great composers. These composers were almost always European in origin. These Black congregations featuring European music may illustrate what many African American writers and scholars call the divided Black soul. Van S. Bird channeled W.E.B. Du Bois saying, "The two-ness of being Black and American is neither overcome nor transcended in the Christian community. We are not Episcopalians, we are Black Episcopalians." Some notable Black church scholars and social activists have criticized Black Episcopalians. Sociologist and author E. Franklin Frazier wrote that any Negro who prefers the Book of Common Prayer to the storefront church is a traitor to his people. Booker T. Washington is recorded as saying, "If Blacks are anything but Baptist or Methodist, then white Christians have been tampering with them." As you can imagine, African American Episcopalians didn't really take this lying down, and they fought back a bit. John Burgess, the first Black diocesan bishop in the United States, said of these statements, "It was a stupid remark when it was made, and it does little credit to those scholars in the field of the Black church who seem to hold this view." In another publication, Burgess wrote, "For conscience sake, we Black Episcopalians must understand that we are legitimate, not only in the eyes of these people, but to white Episcopalians as well." And on the very next page he wrote, "If we believe they are wrong, it is our task to interpret our place among them, that they are no longer uncomfortable with us and will welcome our contribution as an enrichment of the total Black religious experience." Following the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s, Black Episcopalians began to redefine their place in the Black church. African American priest Robert E. Hood fought back against the critiques by saying, "Black Episcopalians are as licit and legitimate heirs to the rich legacy of the Black experience in terms of its being shaped by the institution of slavery as Black Christians from the more numerous Baptist and Methodist traditions." Robert Avon Bennett, author of Black Episcopalians, said, "The Black Episcopalian has demonstrated the authenticity of his religious commitment by his persistent struggle to maintain his racial ethnic identity within a larger church body which has not readily acknowledged his presence. The Venerable Hartshorn Murphy, Archdeacon of Los Angeles, addressed the 1989 Union of Black Episcopalians with the words, "As a result of the civil rights and black consciousness movements, something remarkable happened. We as a people rediscovered the validity of emotionalism as a religious expression. Where previously black church ladies in the Episcopal Church would go home on Sunday, remove their veils and gloves, and sing and listen to spirituals and gospel music, today they want to do that in church, at least occasionally." This statement makes me think of the early Methodists in England who would go to church in the morning and do the standard prayer book service and sing metrical psalms, and then during their society meetings sing a completely different repertoire of music. I think it's similar to what these church ladies experienced. The publication of the first edition of Lift Every Voice and Sing played an enormous role in the struggle for acceptance, both self-acceptance and the acceptance of others. Its publication demonstrated that being black and Episcopalian are not mutually exclusive. The editorial committee of Bayless II decided very early on that they would include music from the following genres: Negro spirituals, traditional and contemporary gospel songs, adapted Protestant hymns, such as the Watts repertoire I discussed last week, missionary and evangelistic hymns, service music and mass settings, both in traditional and gospel styles. Later, they decided to include a section of hymns for African American saints on our church calendar. Trying to figure out what musical examples to include in today's Music Monday was kind of difficult because of copyright restrictions. Remember that for most of its history, African American church music was an oral tradition. Someone would create a melody and they would pass it on to someone else who would pass it on to someone else and pass it on to somebody else. It's like the child's game telephone, where the message goes from one person to another person 20 people away, and it changes over time. Also remember that individuality and improvisation are very important in African American music. As such, it's hard to nail down what the original melodies might have been. Another important thing to remember is that for much of history, it was actually illegal to educate African Americans and to teach them to read and write. All of these things come together in the music collected in Bayless II, which means that much of it is under copyright still today because it's newly written down. While our music performance license at St. Mark's includes music for services, it does not include music for things like Music Monday. However, I can include small examples of certain pieces for educational purposes. So here are your examples. I have two Negro spirituals to play for you. The first is called Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho. And the second Negro spiritual is Free at Last. Lavis 2 also includes traditional and contemporary gospel songs. Gospel music is often called good news in bad times. And one example of traditional gospel music is hymn 106 in Lavis 2, Take My Hand, Precious Lord, by Thomas A. Dorsey, a leader in the gospel music scene of his time. As for contemporary gospel music, I tried to figure out what would qualify under contemporary in this hymnal, and honestly, I struck out completely. Lavis 2 doesn't easily identify or qualify the music it contains into these categories the editors laid out. I looked up popular gospel artists from the 1980s and early 1990s and looked for their music in Lavis 2, but couldn't make a match. Of course, contemporary is always a relative term. What was contemporary in 1993 is old now. That's one of the struggles with published materials. As soon as you publish the book, it's out of date. To give you an example of what I mean by contemporary being a relative term, I looked up the Billboard charts for 1993 and discovered that the #1 song was Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You. And #2 was the tag team's Whoomp, There It Is. The Lavis hymnals also included adapted Protestant hymns such as the Watts repertoire. Hymn 79 is an example. The text is Jesus, Lover of My Soul, which is also in the hymnal 1982 with the tune Aberystwyth. Jesus, Lover of my soul. But in Lavis 2, it is with Charles Wesley's original tune. Hymn number 12 is another example of an adapted Protestant tune, Come We That Love the Lord. It's an Isaac Watts text with a tune by American Baptist minister Robert Lowry. A good example of a missionary and evangelistic hymn is hymn number 159, Lift Him Up. One example of a piece of service music included in Lavis 2 is the Gloria from the Intercession Mass by David Hurd. David Hurd was the professor of church music at General Seminary in New York for many years, and now serves as organist at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Times Square. It's difficult to decide whether this particular piece of music belongs in the traditional camp or the gospel camp of service music that the editors intended to include. It contains elements of both. The organ registrations and indications in the music are fairly traditional and more on the classical side, but the rhythms and harmonies used in this Gloria are anything but traditional and definitely fall in the gospel camp. And finally, the Black Saints section of this hymnal. Hymns 44 through 51 are hymn texts that tell about the lives of the Black Saints on our church's calendar. Hymn 44 tells the story of Absalom Jones, who is featured in this year's Lent Madness bracket, by the way. He's also the founder of St. Thomas Church in Philadelphia I spoke of a few minutes ago. Of course, these are just a few examples of the 281 pieces of music included in Lavis 2. I hope you have enjoyed this second part of African American church music, and I will see all of you very soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with a red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.